All right, so we're going to get into some more of the social psychology and social behavior. And we're going to look at um, conformity, compliance, and obedience, and then we'll look at some social dynamics and group dynamics that go on as well. So first, conformity, and defining that is conformity is a modification of behavior, modification of your behavior, in order to make it agree with that of a group. And one of the people who did the pioneering research on this is Solomon Asch, and he did a lot of studies. And what he found is that people were willing to change their answer to a question to make it clearly wrong, just in order to fit in with the group responses. And the people who responded knew they were giving the wrong answer, but they did it anyways. And the famous study he did is he had people come in to answer questions for a research study he was doing. And basically they were shown a picture of a line, and then they had to choose a line that matched it. And one person came in and sat at the end of a row, and the other 7 participants were kind of in on the study. And so for the first few questions, the 7 participants gave the right answer, but then they started giving the wrong answers. And what Ash found is that the last person in line, that person who was not in on the joke or in on the experiment, would change their answer. And they openly admitted to saying, like, I knew that was wrong and I said it anyways to fit in. And so that's important. And what Ash has found and what others have found is that 3 or more members in a group, that's enough to force conformity. It's enough for us to see the effects of conformity take place. It doesn't have to be a group of 100 or 1,000. It can be as small as 3, and people conform. And we've also found that the desire to conform is highest if you feel like you belong to a large group. If you view yourself as part of a cohesive group, you are likely to conform to whatever those expectations are. And what he's also found is that women and those of social or medium or low social status tend to conform more. It's this desire to fit in. It could also be explained as kind of this social expectation that they are trying to accomplish more, trying to be like somebody else, because where they are at is viewed as less than by society. Also, people in collectivist society tend to be more conformative than those in individualistic, and that kind of makes sense. And then in kind of one of the things that's most important and kind of positive for us moving forward is if one person does not conform, one person in the group does not agree with everybody else, it makes someone much more likely to also break from the conformity. So all we need is one other person to say something, and then we are likely to break that conformity. But if no one does, we are likely to conform and morph with it. And then we have compliance is another concept. And compliance is giving in to the request of others, even if it's at the expense of your own interest. So there are a few ways to gain compliance. One is justification, and that is when you give somebody else reasons for why they should do something for you. Like, hey man, you should definitely join because of this, you should do it because of that, is giving them reasons. The other way is reciprocity, which creates the appearance that you're giving them something in return for their compliance. Hey, if you do this for me, then I will, help you out, hook you up, do this for you, those sorts of things. And so you create an appearance that you are giving something in return for that compliance. Also, another part of psychology that comes along with compliance is something called the foot in the door phenomenon, which is when you want someone to do something big for you, they are very likely to say no. But if you slowly build them up to it, then they are likely to say yes. So instead of starting with the big thing, you start with the small thing. You get your foot in the door. So we see this often in our world. And then it's interesting to note the likelihood of compliance really is heavily dependent on the regard that you have for the person who makes the request. If you trust them, if you like them, if you hold them in high esteem, then you are likely to agree with their compliance. You are likely to agree with them and comply with them. But if you don't trust them or you don't like them, then you're very unlikely to. There are a few reasons why people resist. Most notably, if you've been given a weak argument for why you should comply, then you're unlikely to. And this is called the inoculation hypothesis, which is you're inoculated, you are vaccinated against their argument and against their efforts at changing you because their argument's so bad. And then if people feel like they are being forced against their will to comply, they won't do so. And this is known as the psychological resistance. So I am unlikely to comply if you're forcing me to do so. If I feel like, if I even perceive like you are forcing me to do so. That's compliance. We have obedience, and the willingness to obey and to follow what somebody tells you to do was really, really studied and pioneered by Stanley Milgram and his obedience to authority experiments, where he asked people to administer a test to a subject, and then if they got a question wrong, shock them and continue going on as it went through. And Milgram found that there are really a lot of factors that contribute to whether or not a person obeys. One of the first is there some sense of authority or perceived authority in the person who is giving direction? So for Milgram's experiment, if that person was perceived to be a professor, people were more likely to obey than if they were viewed as like a grad research assistant or just someone who was hired on to do the job. Actual physical distance is huge. If people were in the same room as the person who was allegedly being shocked, they were very unlikely to obey. Likewise, if the person instructing them was further away or on a telephone in a different room, they were less likely to obey. Obedience goes down also when people are made aware that they themselves are to be held responsible for their actions, that they can't blame it on just following orders or whatever it may be. So they tend to be less obedient if they believe they are responsible versus if they believe they can blame somebody else. If the subject witnesses someone else disobeying, it's very much like the conformity, then they themselves are also likely to disobey, or more likely to disobey. And then following that compliance and the foot in the door phenomenon, if someone is immediately asked to do something extreme, they are very unlikely to obey. You have to build them up to it. So you can't administer the highest shock right away, is what Milgram found. You have to build them up to that high shock because they feel like they're kind of just going along with it. So all of these kind of factor into whether or not somebody's going to obey. And what Milgram found is that people are super obedient to a figure of authority as long as certain criteria are met. But people are also very likely to disobey if they feel like they have somebody else who's standing up to pressure with them. So if you feel like you have an ally in your fight against whatever you perceive as being wrong, you are much less likely to obey. And so that's an important thing to know, that we have to kind of stick together in these sorts of difficult situations. Which can bring us to group dynamics. And group dynamics is the overarching term for the phenomenon we see when different people interact with each other. There are two examples of that. One is social facilitation. And social facilitation is it is when you do better at something when you perform in front of other people. So this could be something like sports. If you enjoy performing in front of a group of people for sports or playing in front of a crowd, you tend to do better than that you may tend to do better. And then the other is social inhibition, where the presence of others makes your performance significantly worse. And we've found that people who, depending on what the task is and how familiar it is to you, you may have both of these things. So if it's something you've done forever in your whole life, then social facilitation is what you'll experience. But if it's a new or unique event or experience, then you might have social inhibition because it's difficult to perform in front of other people. Another group dynamic you may be familiar with is something called social loafing. And that is when there are large numbers of people in a group, effort is reduced because you have a large group. So it is reduced effort because I have so many people. I will assume that somebody else in the group will pick up the slack because there are so many of us. And social loafing is what that is called. And people are more prone to this when they feel that their performance is not being monitored and will not be assessed. So if it doesn't matter, I'm even less likely to perform. But there's also a belief that there's a lot of people in my group, I don't have to perform. The other thing in group dynamics is people can experience an exaggeration of their initial attitudes and go to more extreme. And so that is known as group polarization. And so the definition of group polarization is when the judgment of a group is more extreme than individual members. The sum is larger than its parts. So, for example, if you took a bunch of KKK members and put them in a room and asked them attitudes about race, that result would be even more extreme than their individual members. In large part because they're trying to outdo each other. That is group dynamics. I'm the more extreme one. I'm the better one. And so that is group polarization. And it doesn't always happen in like that far-fetched of situations. Sometimes we see conflict exist within group, and what research has shown is that the most effective way to resolve conflicts between two groups is to get them working together in a cooperative manner towards a goal that is larger than both groups, and a goal that is seen as being mutually beneficial to those groups. That's the best way to resolve conflict. And another technique that's used is called the GRIT, graduated and reciprocated initiatives in tension reduction. And basically the idea is that if two groups don't get along, it's the simple act of announcing that they want to reduce tension and then working to give small behaviors that show conciliation, that alone will help reduce tensions, so long as that conciliatory tone is reciprocated. So if these two groups that don't get along say, hey, we want to work together, and here's the first thing we're going to do, and here's the first thing we'll do. As long as you keep working towards that together, you actually see a reduction of tension, which again, it just makes sense. And the last thing we'll talk about in this group dynamics is something called groupthink. And Irving Janis is the first person to kind of talk about this. And in groupthink, it is when members of a group are really trying to reach a unanimous decision. And because of this desire to reach the unanimous decision, they often don't evaluate all the consequences of their actions. And so you see people making bad decisions in groups. This tends to happen when groups are isolated and homogeneous, when it's the same type of people and they're isolated, or there's a lack of leaders either inside or outside the group. So you see sometimes the larger social interactions at play, and there's high pressure for decisions to be made. And so when all of these combine, you have people who start to feel like they are invulnerable and omnipotent. And that is that they know everything and nothing can affect them. And the results of this is that they often make really, really, really bad decisions. And we see this when we look at politicians who surround themselves with a bunch of yes men, or business people who surround themselves with a bunch of yes men, and then they make a poor choice and everyone can point to that and say, how could you be so stupid? But when they're surrounded by people who are saying, this is right, we all think the same, groupthink, no strong leaders, then yeah, they make poor choices. And so in order to combat that, a lot of people have what they call a mind guard, which is someone whose job it is to challenge every idea that's thrown out, and to challenge every possible decision that's being made to kind of prove the other thing. It's essentially playing devil's advocate. Another area where you could see groupthink happen is in juries sometimes, although it's less likely because these groups tend not to be homogenous, but they are isolated. And so you see that sometimes they have this high pressure to make a decision and they just go and bend their will to follow the group. And so that is certainly one of the dangers of interacting in a group.